Ladies and gentlemen, the next session is on 4G LTE wireless and beyond. We're going to try an interesting experiment before I start my this session, because our next speaker has got a lot of value to add. Because if we switch our mobiles off and we're not contactable, this is where Mr. Tony Gray, who's the Regional Business Director of P3 Communications, will excel in his knowledge, because his particular slant on the topic in his company, through his professional activity, through TETRA and Critical Communications Association, is about what happens when your mobile phone actually goes down. And those of us who now move to the Middle East appreciate what a panic we are when we can't get any connection at all on our mobiles. So for this session, I'd be grateful for the next 15 minutes if you just turn your mobiles off and then look at the land that Tony's going to now outline, a land where mobiles have gone down. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be back in Bahrain. I actually realized when I went last weekend to the Formula One Grand Prix that I was at the very first Formula One Grand Prix in Bahrain 10 years ago. I have been in the kingdom since, but this was last weekend my most recent opportunity to attend what was a fantastic race, I have to say, and huge congratulations to all of those of you or those in the kingdom who were involved in organizing such an event. I thoroughly enjoyed, and I hope that today I'll be able to give you a little bit of insight into what we call critical communications. So we're all very used, as you rightly heard, to our day-to-day mobile communications. We all have smartphones and we all call each other and go onto Facebook and Twitter and send videos and all the rest of it. But there are those in the world who require what is termed critical communications. So in other words, their communications are critical to delivery of their services, their mission. And I'm talking therefore, of course, about the emergency services, the police, fire and ambulance, but also the infrastructure operators, the transportation operators, the utility operators, anyone who has to have that mobile service at the point at which the major incident has happened, the plane crash has happened, the train crash has happened, the terrorist incident, God forbid, and so on. So I'm going to try to see if the technology will work for me. Which button do I press? I'll try them all. Now, gentlemen, can you advise me on which button I need to press to make the slides come? Ah, there we go. Okay, so yeah, my topic for today is developing mobile broadband for mission-critical users. And as you see from my various titles, I have a lot of association with a technology that has existed now for more than 10 years. Again, I know because it was there in the very first Grand Prix being used here in Bahrain, a technology called TETRA. And that is pretty much the de facto standard for critical communications throughout the world, and provides excellent voice and but limited data capability for these critical users like the emergency services and so on. So we've been working now for the last couple of years or so towards developing the capability of a broadband mobile communication solution for those same type of users. And that's what I'd like to focus on this morning. So why critical broadband? Why can't these users like the security people down at the Formula One Grand Prix and the police and the fire and the ambulance and so on, why can't they just stick with their, as I say, wonderful Tetra radios? Now what have I done? Help. I apologize. I'm supposed to be a technologist, but I'm the last to make technology work. Whilst we wait for the slide, I'll just tell you, 4G broadband, you hear it bandied around everywhere, and driving around the island, I've seen so many adverts for you can have 4G. You can have it from Zain, you can have it from Viva, and everybody wants to, on their smartphones, to have the latest, greatest, fastest, widest pipe to be able to send all their data. So everybody's talking about it, the consumers want it, and the commercial networks globally are all already rolling out. I have to say, and it's not unique to Bahrain, but I looked at the Bahrain coverage for 4G LTE, as it's termed, and it's not super. It doesn't go so very far at the moment, but it's expanding, and it will eventually equal the coverage of 2G and 3G services already available to consumers today. In the United States, an organization called FirstNet has been set up by the US government by law. President Obama signed a law a couple of years ago that FirstNet is mandated to deliver nationwide public safety broadband services across the whole of the US, and this will be a first. Equally, in my original birth country, I call myself European these days because I live in my wife's home country of Poland, and I work for a German company, but I'm actually originally a Brit, and I carry a British passport. The UK Home Office proposes to procure an LTE-based service, again, for public safety. The UK has benefited from a very good quality, again, Tetra-based radio system for all the emergency services for more than 10 years, almost 15 years now. And so the UK looks towards the future of broadband and would like to have an LTE-based service. I apologize for all the acronyms. These are inherent in our industry, unfortunately. For anyone who doesn't know, LTE actually stands for long-term evolution. I like to think of it as more long-term employment, and hopefully that'll be the case in my and many other people's cases. So other critical communications users, of course, would also love to have the capability to send and receive video and have apps and work in a broadband way, much as consumers do today, and including here in the Middle East. For example, in Qatar, there is already a pilot network established using LTE technology for the Ministry of Interior and the public safety people. What is happening? The TCCA, the Tetra and Critical Communications Association that I represent in my spare time, they don't pay my wages, but I do most of my work on behalf of P3 Communications, the German company who employ me, for the TCCA. They have established a thing called the Critical Communications Broadband Group, the CCBG, and I have the great honor to chair that group. And that group was established to drive the standardization of common global mobile broadband technology solutions specifically for critical communications users. We can never forget that these, what I term critical communications users, are a tiny, tiny flea of an ecosystem sitting on top of the huge elephant of commercial mobile user ecosystem. So, and we can think of it in number terms. If there are more than 30 million critical communication users of all sorts, emergency services, transportation, utilities, all the other people who really have to have their communications when the balloon goes up. If there are 30 million of those around the world, I'll be impressed. And the latest numbers vary somewhere between 6 and 8 billion mobile users in the commercial world. So you have to think of those kinds of scales when we're talking about wanting to have critical communications users have the same capabilities as commercial users benefit from. We are also, as well as working on standardization, we're also lobbying regulators, because all of these technologies I'm talking about are essentially just radio, and they only exist when they have spectrum and frequencies in which to operate. So it's very important that we find spectrum in which to put these technologies. So the CCBG's goals are clearly stated. We would like critical communications users to be able to access their information systems, applications, and so on as reliably and at broadband speeds as they can on their current professional mobile devices, for example, Tetra, and wherever they are and wherever they have the need. And we have to ensure that the critical communications solutions that we're defining and specifying and standardizing meet the particular needs of critical communications users just as reliably as the current technologies do. And I'll explain a bit more about the specific users' needs in the critical communications world as I go through. Some of the key issues, technology standards. The TCCA and I personally and the whole ecosystem are very strongly focused towards common open standards. In other words, not proprietary technology that you can only buy from one source, one vendor. That has a great many benefits, not least in driving the prices down through competition, but also in driving innovation and getting new developments that might otherwise not have come to the market. So we need to make sure that the standards we develop for critical broadband can be made adequately functional, secure, resilient, and available, just as the current standards for narrowband and voice-only services are. And work in that sense is progressing right now in several so-called standards development organizations. One is the 3GPP, the Third Generation Partnership Project, which was originally put together to develop the 3G standards and is now working on 4G and even looking towards 5G. And the other is ETSI, the European Telecom Standards Institute, which defined GSM and also Tetra and a variety of other technology standards around the world. Which button should I be pressing? This one. Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, so I'm doing that. In terms of spectrum, as I say, we have to persuade regulators around the world that they will part with some small part of this very valuable resource that they have that can otherwise be auctioned to the commercial operators to allow some space for spectrum in which critical communications broadband networks can be operated. So far, only North America, the US and Canada have set aside spectrum in 700 megahertz. Australia, the regulator has announced some spectrum in 800 megahertz. And in fact, about a year ago, the UAE, very, very nearby to here, the UAE regulator announced 700 megahertz spectrum dedicated for critical broadband based on LTE. So in terms of budgets, of course, these things don't come cheap. They're all costing a lot of money. So we need to be able to persuade administrations, politicians, fund holders, whoever's actually going to have to put money into investing in these things, of the value of investing in critical broadband. Again, as I said earlier, a lot of these types of users I'm talking about, the critical users, have very functional and very resilient and reliable and capable Tetra type, predominantly voice call type systems. So why do they suddenly need broadband? Why do they need video? Why do they need to be able to access apps? And is it just because they would like to be as good as the average citizen on the street? No, there are very compelling reasons why broadband will be an important addition to the armory of these types of users. And finally, how to deliver such a service. You know, as I was saying earlier, very often, traditionally, it's been a case of setting up an entirely separate and standalone infrastructure, different set of towers, different set of transmitters, and all the other infrastructure required for the critical users. For the future, it may be that some form of resource sharing model or some MVNO, mobile virtual network operator model may help to defray or spread the cost of providing critical services for critical users. In terms of stakeholder collaboration, there are a number of participants involved in this group, the Critical Communications Broadband group that I chair. They are, of course, some of them user organizations, but also governments themselves, operators of critical communications networks, standards and regulatory bodies, equipment manufacturers, who, of course, have a keen interest in where the market will move to, and even a few consultants like me. So simply all members of the Tetra and Critical Communications Association are entitled and encouraged to participate, and the TCCA has over 160 members representative of the whole of the world in terms of every continent in the world. So besides those, we also have a number of collaborators and other partners who are focused on the same ultimate goal of a single global standard to deliver the needs of their critical users. Examples you see here including the Union Internationale de Chemin de Fer, if you forgive my rather crude schoolboy French, which is the UIC, and that's the European Rail Union that controls and mandates standards for railways, the European Utilities Technology Council, some acronyms that I won't even bother to try to explain, NIPSTIC and NIST in the US, which are essentially driving towards this FirstNet capability that I mentioned. Their equivalent in Canada, CITIG and CATA, and PSCE, the European Public Safety Council, the Association of Public Safety Communication Officers globally, including the US, the UK, Canada, and Australia, and so on, and so on. So you can see that there are a large number of stakeholder organizations around the world who are all focused in very similar way to the CCBG, and we're all working together, which is delightful. Just quickly, in terms of the types of people who participate in the CCBG, you can see there in the pie chart over 60 individual organizations, many of them industry, of course, but also governments and operators and researchers and so on, as I was saying before. And a good proportion of those representative of the user requirements, specifically utility organizations, health, transportation, fire, and police. And we have a wide range of external connections, most importantly over in the right-hand side there in blue into the standards development organizations. I mentioned 3GPP and ETSI. So a lot of the work that's going on in all of those other bubbles is feeding out to get the standards developed in the way that they need to be. In that technology standardization, there are these fundamentally required features for critical communications which are not necessarily a part of the normal commercial LTE 4G standards. And those include, for example, group working. A typical, let's say, policeman does not make a one-to-one call to his colleagues or to his control operation. He makes what's termed a group call. So he makes a broadcast call to his entire group of co-workers and to his controllers. And everyone on that talk group is aware of the communication going to and fro. As I said before, this is not inherent in a technology like LTE, which is strictly a point-to-point communications tool. So group working will be established in the 3GPP LTE Release 12, which is coming at the end of this year, 2014. Another mode that critical users have, which you and I don't have in our normal cell phones, is called direct mode. Can I go back a bit? Because I've lost you there. Yeah, there you go. Direct mode is device to device outside of the infrastructure coverage. So when I have no bars on my mobile phone, I can't use it because it can't communicate to the network. Direct mode allows me to still make a call from my device to all the other devices within radio range of this walkie-talkie, if you like. So again, that's very important for critical users. It's used, for example, by firemen when they go into a blazing building that may not necessarily have radio communications connection to the network. They can still talk to their co-workers around the incident. And similarly, anybody else going into any area of no network coverage still has communication with their group. There are significant aspects of additional resilience and security which are built into typical critical communications networks, simply in terms of the security and resilience of backhaul, connecting the transmitter sites back to the core, the power support for base station sites far away on tops of hills or wherever they may be, to have not only battery but also generator support in the event of mains failure, and so on. So some of those capabilities are now being thought about to be standardized within the 3GPP LTE standards to ensure that critical communications users have just as resilient and reliable and secure technology using LTE as they currently do. And finally, but by no means least, there is a need ultimately to put voice, speech over LTE as well as broadband data. And that is not yet a capability of LTE. All the commercial LTE implementations that you currently have are defaulting back to the existing 2G and 3G bearers when a voice call is being made. So a lot of work going on there in 3GPP and in ETSI. And the TCCA last year was formally recognized as what's called an MRP. And an MRP is a market representation partner. Simply all that means is that we, as the TCCA, can take market advice and bring a consensus view of what the critical communications market needs into 3GPP, which, as you will understand, is necessarily a very consumer-centric organization for the meantime. It comprises a lot of the commercial operators, the suppliers to those commercial operators, and so on. So they don't necessarily understand all of these details of group communication, direct mode, and the special needs of critical users. So we can help to bring those requirements and the understanding of those capabilities into 3GPP. As far as progress on the standards work, I mentioned group working, direct mode, resilience, and push-to-talk. Each of those has now a 3GPP work item, and 3GPP works in releases. I mentioned release 12 is coming at the end of this year. The release cycle is something between 18 months and 2 years. So some of these capabilities will already be inherent in release 12 at the end of this year. The rest will come almost certainly in release 13, the subsequent release, within 18 months to 2 years of the end of 2014. So by the end of 2016, it's hoped that we have all of these core capabilities built into 3GPP LTE. The CCBG has a number of publications which, if you're interested in this topic, and I hope at least one or two of you are, otherwise I've been boring everyone for far too long. But if you're interested, there are some publications available on the TCCA website. The links are there to help you to find and download them. But in short order, there's a white paper which just gives some information and general guidance for users, operators, and others who are considering implementing these kinds of technologies, and sets out a bit of a roadmap, a feeling for the timescales as to when standards might be available, when equipment might start to be available, and when, therefore, it's reasonable to consider that you might have a chance to implement a useful and working and capable system. We've also created a couple of documents, one called the Strategic Case, which is addressing this, how do we persuade governments, authorities, budget holders, and so on, of the, if you like, value proposition for critical broadband, and also the implementation options paper, which addressed the other aspect I mentioned of how should one best consider to implement these? Do we, at the one end of the extreme, just go the traditional route of setting up a complete, separate, standalone infrastructure and operating that as a standalone network? Or at the other end of the extreme, do we just go to Zane or Viva and say, please, I'd like all my policemen and firemen and so on to have mobile phones and to use your network services, and you send me a bill at the end of the month just like you do for my own mobile phone. Somewhere between those two extremes is probably the reality, but let's see how those implementation options pan out. And finally, perhaps not quite so relevant in this region, but certainly very current in Europe, a couple of papers, one by an organization called WIC Consult from Germany, and one by the London School of Economics, have been created to demonstrate the social need for critical communications and the socio-economic benefits of the same. And those are all aimed at really at the spectrum lobbying intense activity that's now ramping up towards the World Radio Conference 2015, which will consider whether, and if so, how, spectrum should be harmonized and dedicated for these kinds of applications. So that's all I wanted to tell you, and thank you all very much for your patience and attention. I'm conscious that I have thrown an awful lot of information and a lot of acronyms at you, so I'm extremely happy to welcome any questions or comments that you have either now or later on. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Tony.
All right. So I'm going to go from a different perspective from wireless networks, and I'm going to start with the consumer. I think most of us here in the room had a phone when, it just said GSM, and we got small bits of data, and that evolved to 2G, which is edge. So a bit higher, a bit more data, and we keep that we keep seeing that increasing to the 3G when it came. But over time, what happened? The mobile operators found that every time a new technology rolls out to deliver higher speed, they had to upgrade the entire infrastructure. So between the shift from the 2G to the 3G, they implemented something called FPGA, which is Field Programmable Arrays. And what happened with that is like every update that comes over the 3G, I don't know if that happened in Bahrain, I don't think so, but in the region it's like 3.5G, which is an upgrade. And you've seen 3G go from 2 MB to 7 MB to 21 up to 48. But when that was not enough, we've seen the market try to different standards, which was, I call it the fight of the WiMAX for the consumer, trying to deliver broadband internet to the homes, to the offices, but until it settled over LTE. And now we see the 4G LTE coming all over. For example, in Bahrain, all the mobile operators have it right now. So that's the timeline journey. I know the presentation should be like about 4G LTE and beyond, but I want to go back and see where we are and then take you forward. So on the corporate side, on the business side, we used to implement point-to-point connections, trying to have all the branches and all the offices connected. So 6 years ago, you go to tops of towers and you see unlimited amount of antennas pointing different directions of the country on the island. A year or two later, another technology came out, is point to multi-point, which on the main building you have one antenna and it connects to all the other branches. And over that, it became a multi-point to multi-point, which is more like a mesh network, which you just fire up antennas and it finds the nearest antenna that can recognize, connect to, and connect back to the main office. And we see now, just last month or the month before, for example, one of the mobile operators here released a product that does the same thing, point-to-point, point-to-multi-point, or multi-point to multi-point network over 4G LTE. So from both perspectives of the consumer and the corporate will have seen now we reached 4G, and everyone is trying to use 4G. Interestingly, last night I was attending an event of the Samsung S5 launch, and I think they introduced a feature in the phone that describes 4G LTE and beyond. When it goes back to the consumer or the behavior of people, you see, what do you use your phone for? Fast things, instant messages, instant snapshots of pictures, quick replies to emails, quick looks at. You don't read your newspaper over the phone. You have an iPad, you have a laptop, or you get the printed one. So what they did, they managed to do something called download booster, which you can connect to a wireless network, supposedly be high speed. And at the same time, the phone is connected to the 4G network. So imagine that big file you want to download coming to you over 2 networks, delivering the high-speed connectivity to have a file downloaded. So I think from now on, the trend will be increasing speed for instant bursts of data, because that's exactly what we need. We don't download large files over time or consume high bandwidth of data over our mobile phones. But what 4G LTE provided is a big pipe. So it's supposed to deliver 100 Mbps, which is what the fiber delivers to you now at home and at offices. Although the fiber using light can go to unlimited bandwidth, but the actual bandwidth of the internet you're getting, of data you're getting, is 100 Mbps, which is exactly at 4G LTE. So that fiber, that wire, is not there anymore, hence the 4G wireless. So I think the next trends that are going to come is where it can improve on those bursts, on those pipe, on those aggregation, and the ultimate use of the speed of connectivity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. I mean, what that really does raise is very, very important issues, is what exactly one wants from one's network. Very much is it going to be about voice or is it going to be about data? And I think this sort of confusion within the consumer is probably much more starker than you've actually said, because we're busy deciding what our phones are for, which have now become a wireless unit in itself. I'm going to open the floor to questions, but take 1 or 2 only, because I know lunch is beckoning again. Anybody got any questions from the floor?
Of course, these speeds in the 4G, I understand that it has a huge impact on entertainment kind of sites, industries, downloading the movies, live streaming and so on and so forth. Apart from that part, those kinds of business models, in other sectors of industry, where do you see the maximum impact will happen because of these 4G kind of speeds? You know, where do you think the next innovation would come? Apart from the media, online videos, and that kind of, you know, in the core sectors, where do you see the impact would be because of this 4G?
All right, so when you go to other sectors, you need to see the implementations of big files. For example, if you're an architect and you need to do a follow-up on one of the constructions, and you need instant access to data that you might not necessarily be storing on your phone. So in that second, in that burst, you want to download your blueprints and see the progress of that construction as an architect. So those kind of applications, when you go to a doctor and you have your imaging or x-rays done somewhere else and you want to show to the doctor, or the doctor is somewhere attending a call somewhere else in another hospital, they're not limited to the office. So if you take those similar applications of big files, I don't want to say big data, but about big data something else, but big file sizes that you use on a daily basis or within work, this is where the applications come in the other sectors.
Okay. Any further questions? Thank you very much, Ahmed. Tony, thank you very much for making the trip and coming to Bahrain.